So we've got two cells here, or things, and on each of them we've got a receptor, and on the other one we've got a few more receptors. And I've set up a little animation here so that this molecule goes from, very quickly, from, leaves this receptor and then flies around a little bit and then comes down and binds to another receptor on another cell. Okay, so if we zoom out, we can see this a little better. We've got this thing happening. Now, how do we want to shoot this? Well, I'm going to do this with 3 different shots. I'm going to have one shot that's more close up here, showing this molecule leaving this receptor. And then I'm going to have something that's going to demonstrate the relationship between cell A and cell B, show where they are kind of in space, or at least show the fact that this molecule is traveling from one to the other. And then we also want something a little more close up, showing this molecule binding here. We're going to be using just a single camera to do this, and if you were doing this with more complicated scenes or more often, you might want to explore something called the camera sequencer, and that's under Windows Animation Editor's camera sequencer. And this is a way that you could have several cameras in your scene, and basically you're cutting between them, cutting back and forth between them, and so it's a little bit more of an involved process. But we're just going to use a single camera. You want to do a little single frame transition trick so that it looks like we're cutting between different cameras. So let's first of all create our camera. So we can go create cameras, camera, and I'm going to call this camera shot cam, as I tend to do. Now, where is this camera? Well, if we hit F, we can see that this is hiding out inside one of these cells here. So let's bring it out and let's scale it up. And scaling it up doesn't really change anything, but it just will allow us to see it a little bit more easily. And what we want to do is we want to start out by having it framed in on this receptor at the beginning of the shot. So I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'm going to look through selected, and right now we're not looking at anything. If we tumble around, we can kind of figure out where we are. This is cell A. This is what we want to be looking at. And I'm going to tear off a copy of this view, and then work in the perspective view otherwise. So we've got this camera here pointing up and looking at this. Now it's a little hard to see what exactly it's looking at, so I like to turn on the frustum display controls. So in the attribute editor with the camera selected, I'll turn on display frustum, and that's just basically pointing the field of view so that we can just see a little bit more easily what this thing's actually looking at. The other thing that I want to do in here is turn on the resolution gate. We've talked about that before, and that's really important to actually get an accurate sense of what the camera, what's actually going to be in the rendered frame. So in the shot cam view, if we go view, camera settings, resolution gate, now we can actually see what's going to be in and what's going to be out. So again, that's view, camera settings, resolution gate. This region, this grayed out region around, is called the overscan, and there's a setting in the camera settings. If we scroll down to display options, and that's going to be partway down, we've got this overscan, and it comes in as 1.3. That's the default setting, but we could reduce that to 1.1 or 1.2 and just get a little bit more, a little bit larger view and a little bit less of the gray overscan, so that it's not taking up quite so much space. Something like that. What we want to do is we want to get this camera framed up on the receptor. And so currently we've got the move manipulator in the world setting, and so if I hit Command Shift right click, I can get the little marking menu that allows me to change that the orientation of the manipulator, and so I change it to object, now you can see it's oriented along with respect to the object. You can also change that in the move tool settings. We've got object versus world. Okay, so let's move this up here, and for the initial view, you could go into the actual perspective view or the shot cam view and kind of frame up on it. If you find that it's hard to move the camera around, like it's hard to dolly in and out, it's almost as though there's resistance to you actually moving, that probably has to do with how the camera's basically where it's looking at. And so if you find it's really hard to move the camera, you can just select an object and hit F, and that will kind of recenter the focus of the camera and allow you to move a little bit around a little bit more easily. So maybe I want to start with my view here. And so we're going to set an initial key on the camera. So with the camera selected, we can make sure that we've got the camera selected. I'm going to hit Shift W and Shift E. And if we go to the channel box, we can verify that the translates and the rotates have had a key applied to them. And you can see on frame 1, we've got a key applied to it. Now, what's happening here? Okay, so at about frame 30, the molecule is leaving the field of view. Maybe frame 29, it's leaving the field of view. And at that point, I want to cut to a different scene. But maybe I also want to have the camera, just before I do that, I want to have the camera dolly out, pull out just a little bit. So now I realize I made a mistake. When I select the shot cam, you can see that there aren't any keys applied to it. And so what I accidentally did was I applied a key to the perspective camera and not the shot camera. So that's an easy mistake to make. If I do view select camera, you can see that we've selected the perspective camera, and yes, I've made a mistake with the keying there. So I'm going to right click, break connections to get rid of those keys. And I want to make sure that on frame 1, I've got the shot cam selected rather, and key those. So I can right click and key selected. Okay, so now we've got a key on shot cam, and then on frame 30, I'm going to dolly out a little bit, and now I'm going to set another key, so I can either hit Shift W E, or I can right click, key selected, and now we've got this slight dolly motion as the camera is moving out. So now I want to do a cut. I want to cut the camera so that it's further away and so that we can actually follow the motion of the molecule. So if I go just one frame forward, if I go from frame 30 to frame 31, now I can move the camera, and maybe I'll move it sort of halfway in between. And I'm going to rotate the camera so that we've got sort of the first cell in view. And I'll set a key there. So, key selected. So now we can see if we go from frame 30 to frame 31, it's essentially a cut. The camera's moving, but it's moving over the course of a single frame, and so it's essentially cutting from one position to the other. So now we've got kind of more of a close-up, and then we cut to a wider view, and then the molecule is going to move around, but we want to follow it down. So as it goes down, we're going to tilt the camera down and maybe pan the camera right a little bit, something like that. Instead of, I move the camera, or I moved the time slider, and so now I've actually canceled that operation. I think what I want instead of the camera tilting down immediately, I kind of want to stay on the same view for a little bit. So maybe until frame 70, something like that, I want to have the camera actually holding on that position. So now I can create another key on frame 70 without actually changing any of these values. So again, I'm going to right click, key selected. And now you can see the camera, it shouldn't move at all between those keys. But basically that's what that key does is it allows us to set a starting point for our camera to move. And so now maybe to about frame 200, that's actually the course of the action that the camera is going to take. And so again, we're tilting down, maybe panning right a little bit, and we'll set a key there. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, so we're kind of losing the molecule at the top there as we come down. So maybe this pan is too quick, and so we might want to move this hold a bit later. So we can do that shift clicking on the key or shift dragging over the key, and then with these middle arrows we can move this, and maybe we want to start it more around frame 115. And let's see, so we've got a hold, and now the camera starts to move, and now we're losing it off the top and the bottom because you know what, the molecule is moving around quite a bit. So we could set more keys in the middle here, but my preference is to have as few keys on the camera as possible, otherwise we're going to create a lot of camera motion. So what would be a solution to this? Well, what we could do is we could just pull back a little bit more to have a wider field of view. So we could pull the camera back at frame 31 again. So we're just kind of adjusting our new position, kind of pulling back, and I can hit Shift W and Shift E to kind of adjust that. And I want to make sure that I delete these two keys because those are now going to be keyed at the incorrect position, because I want to make sure that I leave my position fixed, right? So I'm going to hold until maybe frame 120, and I'll hit Shift W, Shift E. And now we're going to maybe, again, frame 200. Now we're going to tilt down and pan a little bit, Shift W, Shift E. So let's see what we do that. Okay, so we're still losing it a little bit at the top. And so maybe we want to move this key a little bit over to frame 220 or something like that. Okay, so that's a little bit better. So now it's still just a simple camera tilt with ease in, ease out, and so we've got the molecule in the field of view. All right, so that's one way that we could cover that transition. So we had to play around with the position of the camera a little bit and how it was moving, but I didn't resort to adding like a whole bunch of keyframes so that it was tracking with it the entire time. I wanted the motion of the molecule to be, you know, left kind of as is. So maybe at about frame 230, now we want to do another cut to a close-up. So from between frame 220 and 230, I'm going to key that again, and so we've got this hold here, and then we're going to cut close-up. So at frame 231, what do we want to do here? So let's bring the camera in, not that far, too close, a little too close. And I'm going to rotate this, pan the camera around a little bit so that it's more from the side view, and maybe tilt up just a little bit so that it's coming into frame at this point here. So Shift W, Shift E, and then the molecule comes into frame there. And we don't really need to set any keys after that point because we're leaving the camera holding there stationary. All right, so let's see what we've got. If we just want to play this section of the animation, this range slider underneath the time slider, that defines the width of your time. So right now it's set to 500 frames. We can either drag this inner bar in, which is kind of setting the in and out points for that range, and then we could slide this back and forth. You can see that these inner values define the beginning and the end of that region. So if we wanted to go from 1 to 250, for example, and that's maybe that's too short. I think maybe 270 to give us a little bit more out time. Or we could change the global size of this animation by changing these outside points, and that's just going to completely that's going to change sort of the global. I don't really know. Functionally, there's not too much of a difference between the end time and the end time of the playback, but that's just kind of how it's set up. All right. So let's expand this and take a look at what we've got here. All right, so we've got the molecule moving, we've got a pan down, and then we've got a cut. Okay, so that's all right. I think there's a couple things that I want to change here. I don't want an ease in, because we're cutting, I don't want an ease into this second key, because I want to cut as though the camera was still in the middle of its motion before we actually cut to our second kind of virtual camera. So I want the tangent at this key to be linear. I do want it to ease out here because I want the start of that camera motion to be gentle, but I just want it to cut directly there. And so we can go into our graph editor to do that. So Windows Animation Editor's graph editor. And if we zoom out, we can see there's a lot of stuff going on. If we hit A, then that's going to frame up on the curves here. So that's going to show us a little bit more clearly what's going on. So if we look at just the translates, for example, you just see these three curves. You can really easily see where the cut points are. These really sharp changes are representative of where a cut's happening. So this is cut 1 from shot 1 to shot 2, and then cut here from shot 2 to shot 3. But we don't have anything. We don't have any curves after this point because our camera's just holding. So where did we have that ease that we wanted to get rid of? Well, it was on this key here. So if we go to frame 30 and we marquee select just over those ones, it's a little hard to not get the frame 31s. And instead of this auto key, we want to change it to linear. Okay? And so now if we change it to linear, let's take a look at, I'm going to minimize that. Let's rewind. So it's a little bit more of a cut at that point, with the camera actually not slowing down and stopping before the cut actually happens. Now I kind of feel as well that first shot is a little bit abrupt. I find that the point of transition is a little bit awkward. And so this is a bit of a trial and error process, but perhaps instead of having the molecule still be in frame here, maybe I want the molecule to go out of frame and then cut to the wider view. Let's see what that looks like. So basically all I want to do is I want to change the timing of this camera, this key. So I'll go back into the graph editor, and this time I'm going to select both of these two keys, frame 30 and frame 31, and we're going to move them a couple of frames down the road. I think that's what we want to do. So I'm going to make sure I get the move manipulator by hitting W, and then I'm going to hit Shift middle mouse button and drag right. Something like that. Okay. And now let's take a look at what this happens. So if we drag, so the molecule goes out of frame and then we cut. Okay, so let's, don't have a lot of real estate here, but let's rewind and play. Okay, so my personal opinion is that that's a little bit better. And I think that the ending shot works as well. So another thing to consider, in our case it's worked out pretty well, but if you have holds like this, where you have two keys that the value does not change at all between them, Sometimes you can find, depending on what's been keyed before and after that position, sometimes you can find that even though it seems like something should be stationary during a period of time, the camera's actually moving or an object's actually moving. And that's probably because, it's possible for these tangents to have something other than flatness to them. And so even though the keys spanning this region of time are identical, the interpolation between them is not perfectly flat. And so what should be a hold actually has some motion to it. So if you find that happening, all you need to do is select the keys and make sure that those have a flat tangent between them. So that's just something to be aware of. Is if your holds have stuff happening in them, just make sure that the tangents are working okay for that. Okay, so the other thing to think about here is what's happening with this molecule in space. When something is moving without any sort of background or context, it's a little hard to interpret the motion, because what's happening is the camera's moving and the molecule's moving, and so that the relationship to one another it's impossible to really know how that molecule is actually moving relative to the cells, because we have the camera moving as well. So one way to resolve that would be to have some background elements that provide that context so that you know how the camera's moving, and so that you know how the camera's moving, and therefore you know how the molecule is moving as well. And that's another reason why it's important to have simple camera motions, because if we had something that was a little bit more dynamic with an object moving without context, it can become really confusing and complicated. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of just to kind of demonstrate how camera animation, how people intuitively tend to approach camera animation, and I'll show you what happens with that, I'm going to delete these two interior keys here. So we've got the starting point of view. Let's say, okay, I'm just going to animate from within the shot cam. So within the shot cam, I want to have the camera kind of up here. Whoops, maybe a little too close, something like that. So I'm going to key that. And then at the middle of the shot, I want to make sure that I've got the molecule in view. So maybe I'll zoom out here, and I've got the molecule in view. And then at the end of the shot, I want, at frame 230, I want to be looking at these receptors down here. And so I want to make sure that I get the molecule in frame here. So this framing looks okay. That framing looks okay. That framing looks okay. Let's see what happens if we play. Okay, so it's the camera motion here. It's really kind of swoopy, and it's kind of disorienting, because what's happening here, I mean, you can see in the view, because we've moved and rotated the camera quite a bit, the camera is kind of going all over the place, and it, you know, it could be a lot worse, but it could be a lot better too. So that's why I recommend doing these kind of simple transforms in the perspective view and creating more simpler camera motion here, because otherwise things like it makes it look like this cell is kind of flying away like a balloon sort of thing. So.